This is a demonstration to introduce the concepts of EntityStream and how you can download adapters for it from a marketplace, how you can define your own feeds to load data in from your own internal sources, how you can review jobs and how they run and the data that's associated with them, like suspended records and tasks that represent duplicates. And finally, how we can bring it all together using a single integrated scheduler. So my first task when I'm in the product is to review the dashboard. On the dashboard, I can see all of the data that's available to me, whether that's entity information from the legal entity foundation, GLIF, whether that's information on issuers from Moody's, Credit Benchmark, Fitch, Standard & Poor, or corporate information from companies like Dealogic. Alongside these external sources that I show in white, I also have some internal sources of information known as my companies and my teams. My companies represents organizations that I do business with that I'm trying to map and match to external information such as LAIs. My team are individuals like employees or agents that work for me that may be attached to those companies. They may be other types of individuals. They may not just be employees. They may also be contacts for external organizations as well. So I can store a whole hierarchy of information relating the two together. When I go into my dashboard, I can see things that have happened over the last 24 hours. I can see the status of my machines. I can see how many duplicates I've got to resolve and how many records I've loaded today. First thing I need to do is load some data. Before I can do that, I need to define what types of information I would like to load. Now, in many MDM situations, what you have to do is you go in and you define a single data model, and that data model represents the way that you look at your information and the way that your external suppliers of information look at their data too. And we try to take the two square pegs and push them into one very small round hole. Now, the way EntityStream approaches this is slightly different. We load the information in the format that they exist, and we match it up in that same format. And what that does is that gives us the ability to load information much faster and much more effectively than other MDM solutions. It does also allow us to create a single unified view. We use data inheritance between the external sources of information that we have and your internal company model to actually create a single trusted record of the best form of information across all of those sources. So from the marketplace, I can decide to choose any of the available EntityStream data connections. And at this point in time, you can see we have connections available to Fitch, Credit Benchmark, Boardex, various Dealogic sources, IDC, the GLIF, S&P, and Moody's. And this list will obviously extend as we go through the journey that we're on. In addition to those external sources, which I should note you still have to have a license for to use the data, in addition to those sources, we also have internal models that you can use as well. So we have a company model and we have a person model. We also have an instrument model and an exchanges model. So any of these models that you can download for free from the EntityStream marketplace will create you an internal entity that you can load your own information into. Whereas all these other sources allow you to load data from, for example, the GLIF, the Global Legal Entity Identifier Foundation, into the same instance to match against your internal data. In addition to those sources, we've also got import functionality and synchronization functionality for products such as the Informatica MDM Multi-Domain Edition. This allows you to take an existing Informatica implementation, import the metadata directly from it from a changeless file into EntityStream to create a set of entities, a set of structures that will support your Informatica model. Underneath the covers, it also allows you to configure the ability to synchronize information as it's loaded into Informatica, it can be pushed directly into EntityStream to be matched, to be consolidated against other sources of data like LEI, Moody's, and IDC. And then when a decision is made or a task is resolved inside EntityStream, it can be pushed back in real time into your Informatica model. Thus, if you already have a large amount of ETL processes, landing, staging processes, pushing information into Informatica, it means that we can then sit on top of that and we can increase the value in what you have in that implementation without throwing everything away that you've done. So to install any of these marketplace connectors, all we have to do is literally just click on one we haven't already installed. So I can pick one from the list and it will ask me for a limited amount of information. Normally it might ask you for an FTP site address, a username and a password, any other connection information that it needs to collect from you so as it can actually not only create a model that represents that source, but also create a feed. That feed, as we'll see later on in the next stage, allows us to go off to FTP sites, HTTP sites, or even just a local file and pick up that information and load it directly into EntityStream. So those feeds themselves are created for you when you install the marketplace connectors. And as you can see here, I already have connectors for GLIF, for Moody's, and for Fitch. And I've also got some other feeds that I may have created myself. Now, this is a very simple process. What we've tried to do with EntityStream is simplify all of the complexity that's involved in an MDM implementation where you spend months building ETL processes into your MDM instance and build it into a very simple step process that any user could do. So I want to define a new feed. So it's asking me to choose a file. I'm going to choose a file. I'm not going to pick the smallest file I've got. I'm going to pick something like a Moody's file. I'm going to open that file. It happens to be an Excel spreadsheet. It could be an XML file. It could be a CSV file. It could be a text delimited file. It could be pretty much any type of file that you can define on your laptop or on a server. And all I'm going to do with that file is I'm going to say, right, here is my Excel spreadsheet. I want to take that data or my XML file, take that data into my Moody's entity. And at the end of it, I might want to save it with a template name. So I might want to call it Moody's 2 because I already have a Moody's file. So let's call it something new. And as you can see along the bottom, there are steps that I can go through that guides me through the process of bringing that information in. Now it's going to ask me for a few bits of information. You know, normally with a CSV, it will ask you for delimiters and quotes and how many skip lines you want to go through before you start reading data. But also I can specify here a file pattern. Now that file pattern means that if I save this template and I want to reload this file every day, but every day that file has a different file name. Maybe it's got a combination of the day, the month, and the year. Maybe it's got a different directory, and maybe it's on an FTP site. All of that information I can specify within this file name, URL, and pattern. I'm not going to do that. I'm doing this as a one-off load, and I'm not going to specify that pattern, which means that every time I try to run this load in the future, it's going to ask me for the file. In this particular example, I want to use this exact defaults for matching. I don't want to change anything. The match process has been set up for me by the marketplace, and I want to just take the standard acceptance criteria for that. So any matches it finds will be treated in a standard way. And finally, it's going to now take a quick look at my file, which is going to take it a few seconds because it's uploading it to a server and it's decoding it and sending the information back to you. And it's going to ask you to map your file columns that it's found into the schema columns that it's got for, in this case, Moody's. Now you can see I've got a list here of many different fields. And really all I want is my Moody's identification number. Now, because the system requires us that we always have an identifier, a legal name, and a country for legal entities for matching purposes, it's not going to allow me to continue. In fact, it will give me an error message and tell me to go back and try again. So what I can do is I know that this file is for all countries in the USA. So I can create a default value there and map that to my Moody's country. Now this means that the file I've got is only valid for USA records. It means that I can't then load UK records using this mapping. I'd have to create a second mapping. But as you can see, it's not a very arduous process, and it's something which I could easily do, save off into my feeds, and then I can schedule that to run later on. So finally, I'm at the last step in my mapping process. I'm going to click on Next. And you'll see that the screen has gone grey. Well, if I go to my messages, you'll see that my Moody's XLS spreadsheet is loading. It's been loading for 6 seconds. All right. So as I go through this process, it will take it's got maybe 35,000 rows in there. It's going to take maybe a minute or two to load. So while we talk about that, we can talk about how we can bring all this information, all these loads together in a scheduled view. So clearly I've created my Moody's 2 feed. My Moody's 2 feed, if I click on it here, it's just simply going to say to me, okay, you've got Moody's 2. Last time you used it, you supplied me with a file. Give me a file. I can just choose the file, I can click load, and it will run the same process for me again. All of the mappings, all of the settings, all of the delimiters, etc. have all been stored in the server and available for any user of this system that's connected to this service to actually load those files. What I might also want to do is I might want to schedule a task to run. Now again, unlike many other MDM solutions, what we have is we've got a fully functional visual scheduler. So I can look at my tasks in a weekly view, a working week and weekends here as well. And what I could say is I've taken my Moody's 2 as a file and I want to schedule that to run at roughly the same time next Friday. So I'm going to pick about 4 o'clock and I know it's only going to take 15 to 20 minutes. So I'll give it a very small time slot. It already knows that I want to use Moody's 2 because that's what I've been working with. But I could also choose to go with any of the investors loads, any of the LEI loads, or I could choose one of the internal system processes too. So if I decided that for some unknown reason I want to rematch all of my data, but I don't want to do that now, I want to leave that until 9 o'clock tonight on a Friday so as it can process over the next 2 or 3 hours and not affect any people, I can schedule my LEI match. I can schedule reprocessing tasks if records have been suspended due to data quality issues. I can schedule those to be processed at a later point in time. And finally, I can also schedule things like purging jobs. If I decide that I want to remove all of my LEI data or my Moody's data out of the system, any tasks and any relationships that are related to that, my purge job will effectively remove all of that data from that system very, very quickly for me, but it still would ideally be scheduled out of working hours. And any of the sources I've got, I can now schedule all of these tasks for. Now, I'm going to schedule my Moody's, but I don't want it just to run once on a Friday afternoon at 4 o'clock. I want it to run every day, or every weekday, or every weekend. And so what that will do is that will schedule the task for today, and then when it runs, you will see that the next day, as this job starts to run, it will go green, as you saw on a previous screen. And it will go green, and the next day's task will show up in the scheduler. So you will always see the next day's task, the next available task for each of these jobs. And you can see back in here, the green ones have been processes that have run, and the red one is a process that ran and failed. So I can go and look at the status by clicking on the I and pop up the information, and then go and look at the jobs information that's associated with that if I wish. So I've got my Moody's task has now been scheduled. I could decide that I want to load my Moody's data maybe only about 3 or 4 times a day. I don't want to run it hourly, but I want to run it, at lunchtime, in the morning, in the evening. So all I have to do is I click another slot on my time schedule, and I can pick the same job and run it again. So I'm not limited to just scheduling a job to run at one point in time. I can run it at any point in time, at any day. And in fact, if you want, you can almost overlap them as well. The process is very, very secure. So as if you're loading 2 files, those 2 files will not interfere with each other. They will still match against each other when they're finished, but when they're loading, it's not a big problem. So if I go back now to my tasks window, you'll see that my Moody's task finished. It finished in 2 minutes and 45 seconds, which proves that I can talk about scheduling for over 3 minutes. And I can click on there and see that it's loaded 35,347 records. It's loaded, it's matched them, it's grouped them, merged them, and created no tasks. It's not surprising, as you saw from my dashboard, I didn't have any records in there, so there's nothing for it to match. Now, Moody's is an external source, so we don't set it up to match against itself. We only match it against other data sources to look where there may be an intersection between maybe Moody's and your internal data, or maybe in our example here, we've set it also up to match Moody's against Fitch. So if I just close this down, I'm going to go back in now and I'm going to choose to go through the same process again for my Fitch file. So I choose my Fitch. I'm going to map it to my Fitch entity. I'm not going to save it this time. I'm not really that concerned. Not really interested in any of these settings. They're all pretty much default, so I can just tab all the way through. As you can see, it's still working. And this time you see it's got 3 columns instead of 2. My first column I need to map is my Fitch ID. It's done a very good job of matching my legal name to my name column in the file. But it has actually incorrectly picked the postcode to be mapped against my country, because I happen to know that in my file my country is called code and it's not called anything else, and so it's tried to do a fuzzy match against the name to identify the appropriate field and got it wrong. So that's fine. You can correct it here and click next, and that job will also now start in the background process, and we should be able to start to see on the dashboard that numbers are starting to appear. As you can see already, we've got now 32,000 Moody's issuers. The Fitch data won't come through until the information has been loaded. So if we click refresh at some point, we should start to see that information will show on our dashboard very, very quickly. Again, I could now go in and I could push that into my schedule. So I can go to my data actions, choose my schedule view. And I could go and pick an appropriate time on my Friday afternoon, pick my Fitch load, run it as a weekly job on weekdays. Sorry, run it on Mondays to Fridays, and click save. And that job is now also scheduled to run alongside everything else. Now, the good part about the scheduler is you can visually see where multiple tasks are kind of overlapping. What will happen, of course, if you set a time limit for a Fitch load, and it is, in this case, I've set it for about an hour. If the Fitch load is running beyond that time, that task will get suspended. Suspension will then, the user will be notified, and the user can come in and decide whether they want to stay suspended at that point or whether you want it to continue later on in the day. So you can decide to leave it in a suspended state and then come back later on and restart that. So I go back to my dashboard in a hope that my Fitch information, which does seem to have appeared now, and you can see my tasks have started to, my chart has started to show that I've got data in there for loaded, indexed, and matched. So now, of course, I should see that I've got some duplicates, and you can see that it's found that there are about 2,000 duplicates between Fitch and Moody's. The number's the same. It represents the fact that there's probably an intersection. And to look at that quickly, I'm going to go and look at my unresolved tasks. Now, my unresolved tasks are simply that. They're tasks that it has found where there's an intersection, which is either a fuzzy intersection between those two sources or any of the sources that we've got. And as you can see, as I scroll down, it's dynamically loading my pages, and we can start to see there are different levels of percentages that represent those matches. If I want to see more information, I can expand that information out to see the full fields. But what it tries to do in the summary here is it gives me a summary of the main concepts within the data. Now we have fields, and we saw the fields as we loaded. Those fields don't necessarily align up between Moody's and Fitch. We have different fields, different uses for those fields. So what we have in EntityStream is this concept, and that means that we say that these fields here represent our address, this field represents our country, this represents our company name. And what we do is we only ever map together those concepts. So when we do matching, we're matching on concepts, we're not matching on the actual fields themselves, which means that the system does a lot of work under the covers to make sure that everything is kind of standardized and normalized, to make sure that there is an easy way to intersect. Once it's done that, clearly it can start going through and look for matches between them. Now, the advantage of EntityStream over a lot of MDM type technologies is it has thousands of rules attached to it that relate to legal entities. Other organizations, other MDM solutions, don't necessarily have the same level of depth in terms of the way that they match the data. If I want to take one of these examples here that I've got, and I can see I've got JP Morgan Chase, which is in North America, what I can do is I can decide to set my focus on that record. So rather than be looking at two records in a pair, I can now look at those two records and where other tasks may be intersecting with that. So as you can see here now, if I'd have chosen that as a good match, if I'd have simply gone in and clicked on accept for that record, I probably would have made the wrong decision. Because if you look at the top here, these are much better matches. And so by having the ability to set the focus on a pair of records, or even in fact one individual record, and what other records it matches to, then I can actually see the wood for the trees a lot easier than I can in other solutions. So I could decide now just to accept this as my best possible match in this group, this cluster of information, or I could accept it and reject all the others that are in focus right now. And that means, of course, that I could resolve not only one task at a time, but maybe hundreds or potentially thousands of tasks by picking the best match for that. Okay, so I'll go back to my unresolved tasks and show a little bit more functionality. So clearly I'm looking at everything what I might want to do here. Let's give this a quick refresh to clear the screen and go back into my tasks for unresolved. I want to now just choose the limits. I'm only really interested in everything that's 98% to 100% between Moody's and Fitch, which of course everything is at the moment, and I click my filter. And now I'm looking at a very, very specific number of records that I'm interested in. Okay, because I've got a very small number of records and I've filtered down very closely, the system is now saying to me, do you want to just accept all of these? Because they look like good matches. Your range is very small. Would you like to accept them? So in bulk, again, you can go through and say anything that's now 98%, 99%, 100%, clear those tasks out of the system so people don't have to go through and review. Now, of course, we can set that in our rules. We can set that when the system does the matching. We can say that anything above 92 or 93%, which is generally the level with legal entities that you'd be looking at, could automatically be accepted for you. But clearly, as this is a new system, we want to learn about the data. We want to make sure we're making the right decisions. And so what we want to do is we want to give the user the ability to understand what those acceptance levels should be before we go through the process of actually doing this. If I decide to reject records or accept records, I have a clear audit trail of the information that's available in the system. So I can click on my accepted tasks or my rejected tasks, and I can see the levels, the percentages that were accepted, who accepted them, when they accepted them, and I could also decide to review that and go back and maybe undo that work as well. So at any point in time, I can look at a time-based view of work that's been done by my teams and actually look at it, review it, and maybe roll it back. I have personal tasks. If somebody decides that, I want to just assign this to one individual, he's the expert with Bowater, he should be looking at this. And then maybe somebody might want to review that, and she can then make the decision to say that, yeah, he did make a good choice, that was the right match. And so we can have a workflow process built around this. Also, in the financial services space, we have things like EMIR sensitivity, high profile entities. We want to push those into a different bucket. We don't want those in the same bucket as everything else. We don't want to get to them later on. We want to deal with them today. So we want to have the ability to filter information to see the kind of the EMIR sensitivity or high profile entities and have those available to us at the touch of a button. And also, because EntityStream is called EntityStream, we can stream potential tasks to you. So if we have information that we've collected on, the best LEI for your entity based upon the linkages that it already has to Moody's and IDC, then of course we'll stream that information to you in real time, and you can review those streams and you can decide whether we've made the right decision and whether other customers making decisions is the right thing for you. Also, tasks aren't the only thing that fall out of data when we load data into the system. What we also start to see in many situations is we start to see data quality issues. If we go back to my dashboard earlier, we finished the Fitch and we finished the Moody's loads. You'll notice I've got a messages tab here. It was flashing 3 messages at me, and one of those messages is warning me about my job. It's saying your job did complete, but it had 2 warnings. One of them has got a missing country, ROM, which is in fact Romania, and another one which is CUW, which I forget what it is. But it's telling you this is affecting 2 records. Now, what I'm looking at on the screen is those 2 records. I could do one of 2 things here. I could decide to go and look at that record. I could view it, I could edit it, I could make changes to it, and I could take this country code CUW or ROM and I could turn it into Romania, and then I could reprocess this record or these records and have it then go back through the process to join all its friends in the Fitch data source. Now, these records are live right now, so you can still search against these, and you still will match against these as well. But of course, there needs to be some level of quality in the data for that matching to be the most effective. Now, I don't want to go and fix all Romanians' records every single time. What I want to do is I want to set up a rule. And at the moment, there clearly isn't a rule for ROM. If I do a search in my concepts, you see there isn't one. I do a search for anything, there isn't one. So what I can do is I can decide to create one. Now I can create a new rule which says the ROM, and I see it, is Romania. And by saving this off, when I reprocess my records, as we saw on the previous screen, those records will get resubmitted through. It will see ROM. It will say, we know about ROM. It's Romania. I'm going to reprocess that through, and I'm going to reattach that to the right country. So that way, instead of us having to do vast numbers of data quality tasks, we can allow the user to set up those data quality rules for us. And that means that when they then resubmit, or the schedule resubmits those tasks through later on, we can start to collect those rules as an organization. Finally, just before I kind of leave this subject, what I will do is I'll show you how we can quickly search the information that we've loaded. Now, we loaded maybe about 50,000, 60,000 records just now in a couple of minutes, which was quite nice. But being able to access that information is also quite useful too. So being able to search in a fuzzy way, to bring back information on, in this case, Morgan Stanley, and you can see that rather than us searching Fitch for Morgan Stanley or Moody's for Morgan Stanley or our internal records for Morgan Stanley, I can do a single unified view across all of my different sources of information very, very quickly, and that will bring back for me any entity type, whether it be an internal entity or an external entity or a person that even works at Morgan Stanley, will all come back to my view here, and they'll be scored and put in order appropriateness of what you typed in. The more information you supply or the less information you supply will obviously affect the score that you get at the end of the day. So this was just a summary of what we can do with the EntityStream solution. Our next presentation will be about the usage of the blockchain, talk a little bit more about streaming of those tasks, and I hope you come back to see us at www.entitystream.com. My name is Robert. Thanks for listening.